Hi, this is Drew Loker, and in part 2 of our painting video tutorial, we're going to learn some advanced tools, including applying a gradient to a layer, perhaps a Gaussian blur, and the spline tool. So let's get started right with this right here. Now I've opened up an existing document, and one of the first things I'm going to do is increase the dimensions of my layers palette. You'll notice that I've got quite a few layers. Some are currently turned off for effect so that I can show you the difference. One of the key things about creating layers is it allows you to make a duplicate of an object that you're going to experiment with. For example, our layer 6 background right here that I just turned off is a composite of colors and then a Gaussian blur applied. There's actually two different ways you can do a gradient for a background, so I'm going to turn off layer 6, and you'll notice some of my layers are named. That's a good thing, and my birds are white, so you don't really see them right now, so I'll just turn those off. And the grass, we can leave that on right now. The main thing is to work on a new layer. Don't work on the background, so I'm going to create a brand new layer here, and you want to go ahead and click on that layer. Make sure it's the active layer. If it happens to be above other layers, you can move it down after the fact. If the other objects are getting in the way while you're drawing, you can bring your layer up into the drawing layers right here. I can move them above the birds temporarily. And the next thing I'm going to do is go to the gradient tool. And the way the gradient tool works is that we have several options. Linear and a radial blur are probably going to be the two most often ones that you use. These are the tool parameters that you can choose between. And to do a nice sunset, we're going to choose a linear. And then we have our start color and our ending color. That's the primary and the secondary color. And so sunsets are generally dark up at the top and lighter down at the bottom where the sun is setting. So we're going to click a blue for the primary, and for the secondary we're going to choose a yellow or an orangey color. And then I'm going to click and drag straight down. And if you go at an angle, your linear gradient will be at an angle, and sometimes sunsets are like that, especially during the winter when the sun is to the south, as opposed to in the summer when the sun is further to the north. The location of your house relative to the background could be different. So anyway, the length of how far you pull that gradient down is going to determine the gradient transition. So if I'm real close, I'm going to get a sharp line, and if I'm far away, I'm going to get a smooth transition. And then I'm going to let go, and there's my layer 10. I can bring that layer back down, and you'll see that it goes below my other objects. I can turn it on and off and compare it to the one that I had before. So just playing around with different options. Now, if you're quick to observe the sun is up in the sky, that's okay. I can turn that particular layer off, and I want to turn layer 7 on for just a minute. And you notice that the sun is sharp. If I click the move tool, and I click that, I can move it around. Now the reason why I've done that on its own layer is so that I can move it around and do a special effect to it. I want to do a Gaussian blur. So I've done a gradient to my sun, which you can also do with a paint bucket, and you can also select your sun. So right now that sun is very circular. It has a sharp edge. But I really can't use the magic wand to reselect it because it does have a gradient. Well, I actually did a pretty good job right there. So if you have a solid color, you can apply a gradient after the fact by clicking your gradient tool first, clicking your magic wand, selecting the object, and then clicking and dragging out the gradient for that object. So let me show that from scratch. We'll do a brand new circle. And I'm going to turn off the selection that's currently active. I'm going to do a Control D to deselect that. And I'm going to go to a brand new layer. It's always easy to start with a brand new layer, and you can delete that layer if you make a mistake. So I'm going to go over here to my Shape Tools and choose just a circle. And I'm going to draw out, right now, So I've got my shape tool active, and currently I'm going, if I were to start drawing right now, I would have a draw shape outline, and it would be a blue outline. So I'm going to go to a draw shape filled. I don't really want an outline, and I'm going to swap those two colors around so that I get an orange sun. And while it's active, I can move it around. One thing you don't want to do is put it off the edge, because if you deselect it, you're going to get only a portion of that sun. It'll cut it off. You can move it around while it's active, but you can't park it on the edge until you're done with this. So while it's selected, I'm actually going to go ahead and click on the gradient tool, and actually the magic wand, and I'll select my sun, and then I'm going to click the gradient tool. And instead of going from orange to blue, I'm going to put it orange to yellow. And that way I can get my transition. Now right now it's on a linear, so if I want a radial, I'll need to click the radial gradient, and then I can get that as if it was a sunburst. Now right now that doesn't look realistic, because the sun's going to be not very sharp at the horizon. It would be sharp up in the sky, but when it gets close down to the horizon, the sun is going to, the dust in the atmosphere is going to affect the sharpness of the sun. It's going to appear very large and distorted. So I'm going to go to my adjustments, effects rather, blurs. So this tool that we're looking for, or this effect we're looking for, is the Gaussian Blur. Now at first glance it's going to come up with a very small Gaussian blur, but I'm going to run that radius all the way up until it gets to a nice diffused, maybe 100 and 200, somewhere in there. I'm going to go ahead and do 128. And that blur has been applied, and now I can move it around. Let me click back on the move tool. That was an undo, and I can move that closer to the horizon. I can stretch that out. Put that right there below, between the grass and the background, or right over the top of the house as it's setting in the background back there. Alright, so one other thing I'd like to show is the Spline tool for advanced graphics, things that you'd like to do. The Spline tool, we're going to go ahead and create a new layer, is like a vector graphic in that when you first draw it on the page, let's do a Control-D to deselect. Right now the sun was still selected. And so when I click on the line tool, at first it's going to give me 4 dots. And those 4 dots can be pulled around and shaped so that I can get different size, different types of graphics. One thing, again, I'll remind you is to make sure you draw on separate layers so that you can delete. You can always use the eraser to get rid of a portion. But one of the things I can do is, if I've started with a sketch, I can, let's do an undo. I'm going to undo again because I don't like that. There we go. And I want to grab that and move it to the... So if we've used a pencil to sketch out a graphic, you can then use the Spline tool to turn that sketch, and I'll probably show a graphic in class, and there's other tutorials online that are much better about how to use, free draw. This is definitely outside my capabilities. You've probably determined as far as drawing, but if you can sketch out something with the pencil tool, you can then use the Spline tool to shape and turn that sketch into an outline graphic by using the Spline. And it's a very effective tool. While it's selected, though, you want to move it into position, and if you need to, you always have to go back to your eraser, and you can erase the line. And you can always make your brushes bigger. The brackets make your brushes bigger regardless of what tool you're using. So right now I've used on my keyboard the left and right bracket, decrease and increase the size of whatever brush you have selected, whether it be the paintbrush or the eraser, the clone tool. Let's turn our house back on for a second here. And I'd like to show you how the clone tool works. I'm going to use it at this time to put a window, almost like a dormer, in the roof. So I'm going to click on the clone tool, and I'm on the door and window layer, and I'm going to right click to define my point, and then I'm going to start drawing out. Okay, so we actually got a control click in this particular program. So I'm going to hold down the control key, and I'm going to click, and then it shows the reference point. Different programs do operate differently. Photoshop, for example, versus Paint.net, using the clone tool is very similar, but how you start and the source point that you sample is going to vary. So in this case right here, I'm using the clone stamp tool to duplicate the window, but I can also use the clone stamp tool to get rid of. So I'm going to use my brackets and decrease the size of the brush. And I'm going to control click, and this time I'm going to get rid of the window. Alright, so that last operation did not work, as I was using the clone tool to sample from a layer that wasn't actually, there was nothing there. So in other words, when I used the clone tool and control clicked above the window to get rid of the window, there's actually nothing there. The house is on a different layer, and even if I turn off the house and look only at the door and window layer, there's actually nothing there. There are no pixels to actually clone from. If there was a white surrounding to it, I actually could clone out the window. The easiest thing to do in this case would actually just be use the eraser if I wanted to get rid of that window after the fact. And you can see that if I turn the house back on, I could get rid of the windows. But let's go back up. I don't really want to get rid of the window there. And one thing interesting about the history is that it even records when you turn the layer visibility on and off. So don't let that distract you or get frustrated with it. Just keep going backwards. If you ever make a mistake, you want to go backward. Alright, so the last thing I'm going to do, I guess, for this, you could either use the Spline tool to draw out some clouds, and I'm actually going to create a new layer for clouds. And I'm going to name it clouds so I don't get too confused with which layer is what, and that's very important to do. Now, if the layer doesn't matter whether it's above the birds or behind the birds, in this case I'd want it to be behind the birds. The birds are off right now anyway, and we can just leave the birds on for right now. Now we're working on the active layer of clouds, and you can either airbrush in clouds. This program doesn't actually have an airbrush, but it does have a paintbrush. And one of the other things that I haven't talked about is the edge sharpness. And right now it's set to 75%, and it's called hardness. You also have your brush width. You can either dial it up. I told you could use the brackets to make it bigger. And so what I'm going to do is make the edge of the tool very soft. And I'm going to make my brush a little bit bigger. And if you just hold it down, you don't have to tap it like a woodpecker right there. You can just kind of draw it out. Oops, that's not the right color, so let's undo that, and let's go dial in a white. And I'm going to swap those two colors around. And you can see how diffused the edges are, and I'm going to choose a little different color. Let's click on the white and make it a little grayer. And that way we get some different colors in there. And just kind of do some puffy clouds. And one of the things I'm going to do with this layer, because this doesn't look very good, I'm going to come back in with a little bit darker. So I'm going to paint in some darker clouds. And one of the things you can also do is to change the opacity of a layer. And I'm going to do that too in just a minute here. But first thing I'm going to do is for this entire layer, I'm going to put the effect with the blur. Now, if you see repeat Gaussian blur at the top, it's really best not to choose that because you don't have any control over it. It's like a quick, well, Control F would do the same thing, but it's a quick access. And you want to go to Blurs, Gaussian Blur. This allows you to bring up the palette. And you can see that if I don't dial in a very big Gaussian blur, it looks pretty splotchy up there. So I'm just dialing like a 75 right there, and then I can also control the layer opacity. Over here on the right side of the layer is an icon called Layer Properties, and I can change the opacity of the entire layer so those clouds blend in a little bit better with the background. It's not perfect, but for the effect of this tutorial, hopefully you've learned a few things. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I need to show on the get-go. Remember to save often. and that updates the information on your file, and one of the other videos shows you how to do a file save as to export for the classroom assignment.